This week, we meet Rick. Rick's dad worked at the same factory his entire life. His parents never divorced, and they lived in the same house for most of their lives. So, pretty stable. But we also meet Lorrie, who was all but abandoned by her father, abused by her stepfather, and moved quite often until finally being raised by her grandparents. But pretty much in a cult. Not quite as stable as Rick, right? Not so fast, because things are almost never that simple. Welcome to My Crazy Divorce.
I'm a failure as a husband. I'm a failure as a man.
It's just, I'm beautiful and I'm bright and I deserve better.
It's a great day, I'm feeling good. Oh, the possibilities of what I could. Oh, do with the world at my fingertips. My imagination brings a smile up to my lips. Oh.
Welcome to My Crazy Divorce, everyone. I'm your host, Tom Milligan. I'm really excited to introduce today's guest, not just because her story is so amazing, but because of our relationship. You see, Lorrie started working for the sponsor of our show, OurDivorce.com, about 2 years ago. So I've come to know and respect Lorrie on a professional level as much as I've ever respected anyone. But even though we have Zoom calls almost every day, and while she told me early on that she was divorced, I've never asked Lorrie to share her story privately or publicly. So the interview you're about to hear is the first time I ever heard her story, and it's a doozy. Before we get to the story, I have just a couple of things to go over. First, as I say every time, I'm not an attorney, so please do not consider anything I say on or off this show legal advice. Next, if you haven't done it yet, please pause the show right now and give us a 5-star rating on whatever platform is streaming my voice in your ear right now. If you're considering divorce and if you think you and your spouse can both be reasonable, be sure to give OurDivorce.com a try. Their simple 3-step process guides you through your entire divorce without attorneys. And the best part is that you only pay once you know it will work for your situation, so there's literally no risk. And of course, if you've survived a crazy divorce and you'd like to share the story on our show, please visit mycrazydivorce.com right now and apply to be a guest. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's meet Lorrie. Lorrie, welcome to My Crazy Divorce. I'm excited to hear your story today.
I know. I'm excited to give it, I think.
I think.
I don't know. Last night I'm like, I don't know. But,
There you go. I really appreciate that. As a matter of fact, just so everybody out there can hear this, the bottom line is that our guests are sharing some pretty personal things. Some people are a little bit more reserved about it, but others are ready to go. Lorrie, we've known each other for what? Over a year and a half at least. Almost 2 years,
Yeah.
probably.
When you can't remember, it's been too long.
Yeah. And I've never heard this story. So Lorrie is one of those that is not too forthcoming with this. I'm very excited to hear this. Let's get started and get to know you a little bit. So let's talk about you. Where are you from?
Just like the Johnny Cash song. I've been everywhere. I've lived, well, right now I live in San Antonio. I've lived in Elsa, Illinois, which is a tiny little historic village. I've lived in St. Louis. I've lived in Ponca City, Oklahoma, everywhere. I was born when my mom was 17. And She was actually, so we start at the very beginning. My grandparents were Christian Scientists, which is a very small religion that a lot of people would call a cult. I'm not practicing it anymore. So she was raised Christian Science, and she was going to a boarding school that was related to that religion. Unfortunately, she met my dad the summer before she went. And so when she went to school and then around Christmas time realized she was probably pregnant and then never went back. She did obviously end up graduating high school and then going on to college as well, but there was a kink in the plans. She did end up marrying my dad. She finished high school, but their marriage was like completely rocky from the very beginning. They were living in Illinois with my grandparents at the time. And then at some point, they moved to Amarillo, Texas, which is where his parents were. And
Okay.
during the time that they were married, she had 3 daughters. Boom. They ended up getting divorced. She married a second husband, and that marriage didn't last either. They added my brother to the group. So after the time of the second divorce, we moved back to Illinois, and my mom was trying to figure out what to do with her life. My brother was 5, I was 10, and she decided to join the Army. And so we stayed with my grandparents. And while she was in the Army, my grandparents raised us. And the part that wasn't typical, like I said, we lived in this tiny town called Elsa, Illinois. And that's where the college campus was that was related to Christian Science. My grandmother worked as an admin on the campus. And so we lived like literally, you could walk a block to get to the back gate of the campus and go down a dirt road. It was like a 600 some odd. My sisters and brother and I would agree that it's almost as if we had like a utopian, idyllic childhood. That part of my life was wonderful. They had rules. They were more strict than our children's friends because they were older. But there were rules like she'd ring the cowbell, and if we weren't in hearing distance of the cowbell, we were too far away. But then there were sometimes she'd just be home for lunch or whatever, and I'd ride my bike miles and miles away and go see what the college students had dumped in not the graveyard, the dump, the college dump.
So religion was a huge part of
Yeah.
your childhood.
Yeah, my grandmother would read. So they have what they call a lesson. So they read the Bible, but then they have their textbook that goes with the Bible. They call it the Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And every week they send out a publication that tells you what verses to read in the Bible, and then it is accompanied by verses by the founder, Mary Baker Eddy. And so you read these throughout the week, and then you go to church, and basically all they do at church is they have a reader. They don't have pastors. The readers read the exact same thing you read all week long, and maybe they sing 3 hymns, but that's it. They didn't want any personal interpretation of the scriptures except for what the founder wrote.
So, not to sound like Freud, but how is your relationship with your dad?
He's passed away now, but he was completely absent. They
Okay.
got divorced when I was probably 4 years old, and he was an alcoholic, and he was in and out of jail. He was in and out of marriages. He completely distanced himself from our lives. I never heard from him from the time we visited with him while we were still living in Amarillo. But once we moved to Illinois, I never heard from him again until my senior year in college. The first stepdad was physically abusive with discipline, but would tell us not to tell our mother. And if we told our mothers, it would be worse the next time. And then I heard, I don't remember, but from my mother, she's told me stories about when I was younger, how there was abuse as well.
Let's switch gears now. And let's
Okay.
now that we know you, let's learn a little bit about who we're going to call Rick. And
Okay.
as usual, everybody, we generally don't use real names on here. Some people have chosen to use real names. Lorrie is not one of them.
No.
So we are using a fake name, and Rick is his fake name. So where did Rick grow up? And tell us about the similarities or differences between your childhoods.
So Rick was from Indianapolis, and he was one of 4 children. He was in the middle. The brother was the oldest, and then there was a sister, and then him and a younger sister. They lived in the same house the entire time from the time he was born, actually until after his parents lived in that same house until after he and I were married. So I was 23, 24 years old. His father worked for Chrysler for 30 years, just very like traditional, stay in the same place. Their whole family was from Indianapolis. Nobody ever went anywhere. There really
Sounds like a
wasn't.
Norman Rockwell.
No, it was not.
Oh,
No, my life was Norman Rockwell in Elsa, Illinois. With we would go. I need to stop talking about my childhood, but like Christmas caroling and hot chocolate given to us by the neighbors and things like that. His life, his dad was an alcoholic, like mine was, but
oh,
he never got out of my environment. Changed. His did not.
So religion in his family?
No, it wasn't. They played
Okay.
no role in their life whatsoever. It did later in life. His mom started going to church regularly, got saved. Then church became a really important part of their life after they
After
retired.
Rick was gone.
Yeah, after the kids were out of the house and they sold their home in Indianapolis and moved to a smaller town in Indiana.
Let's talk though about education though, because in your family, you're being sent off to private school and ended up in West Point and everything else. And you're a paralegal. You obviously have attended college and done all sorts of fun stuff. Was education a big deal in his family as well?
No. In fact, so he completed high school. None of the siblings have anything past high school. He wanted to go to, I think, Ivy Tech or some trade school in Texas, but his dad said that he would only help pay for school in Indiana. And so they came to fisticuffs about the whole thing. So Rick just said, fine, I'm not going to go. And so that was the only child out of the four of them that indicated any interest in going to school after high school.
But ultimately didn't go because he got in a fight with his dad about it.
Right.
Got it. Okay, so we have a picture now of these two young people that have had wildly different childhoods. Not the best childhood on either side, honestly. Your grandparents obviously did their best and made yours as normal as possible. His just sounds like like a simmering kettle just ready to blow at any moment, it sounds like. But somehow you crazy kids had to meet up. So let's talk about your first meeting. Where did that happen? How did that happen?
I went on to Principia College, which is the Christian Science College in Elsa, where we grew up and ran around when we were little. And the first semester, I went the first semester, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I thought, I'm just going to go home. And by this time, home was Indiana. My mom and her new husband had settled in Indiana. I'm just going to go home. I'm going to work, save money for a while, figure out what I want to do. So I moved to Indiana and I worked in the mall at a clothing store called Lerner. I think they're like New York something. So I worked in the mall. One of my girlfriends that I knew from work invited me to go with her to one of the state parks in South Indiana for Easter. And she had a whole bunch of her friends were getting together and she invited me to go. So it was early 90s, so 90, 91, something like that. He had on a blue mesh shirt so you could see through it and see a really nice chest, the abs and all that stuff. So he had on the blue mesh shirt and then he had on dolphin shorts. Do you know what dolphin shorts are?
I do.
So he had on dolphin shorts and the blue mesh shirt. And he had a Monte Carlo. He was really into cars. And he had a Monte Carlo that he was super proud of. And he's sitting on the hood with his friends and they're just talking. And he actually is shy at first.
So was Rick and these guys that were sitting on his car, were they part of your friend's friend group, or is this a separate group of people that you just connected with?
Yes, they were all from the same neighborhood with the friend that brought me. So all of them knew each other. I think then, so I became part of the group. I didn't have a lot of friends in Indiana because that's not where I grew up. And then, so my friend's name was Michelle. And so she would start inviting me to go to some of the house parties. We were still underage. And that was really the first time that I had ever started drinking and partying. I think I was 19 years old. And so at one of these parties, I forgot to call my mom and let her know that I was going to be late. And my mom had always said, if you're going to be any later than 11 p.m., you need to call me and let me know. So I'm not staying up worried about you. I forgot. And it was like 1 a.m. by the time I realized what time it is. So I didn't call. And the next morning I called to apologize. She was extremely upset with me and ordered me to come home. And so I'm like, oh God. The tone of her voice was just like, she's not normally that angry. So I was a little worried. So I made my friend come with me. So we drove back to my house. And when I got there, my mom wanted me to come with her. She was getting ready to drive my youngest sister back to, she was like a senior in high school. She was getting ready to drive her to St. Louis so that she could finish out the semester. And she said, I want you to come with me right now. And I'm like, I'm not going. It was like the first time I'd ever been rebellious. And it helped that my sassy friend was next to me. But so there was an argument in the driveway. I refused to go. My mom got in the car and she said, you better be gone by the time I get back.
Like kicking you out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was like, okay. I didn't have anywhere to go. And my girlfriend said she would not be allowed to have me stay there. So I ended up staying at this house, what my mom would later call a flop house, with it's just a bunch of people paying rent, working, partying. So I just stayed there and they'd go to work. If it was my day off, I'd clean the house up after them. Just, oh, you left out pizza. And yeah, I'm embarrassed, but whatever. So I didn't tell my mom. We didn't have cell phones back then. I didn't tell my mom where I was. She knew where I worked. So if she really wanted to find me, she could. She ended up sending me a letter to my job. And I don't remember the contents of the letter, but whatever it was, it made me feel like I needed to call home. She offered to stay with me while I called her. While I called her, she didn't want to talk to me, so I talked to my stepdad. And I felt like it was very sweet for him to stay with me while I made that tough phone call. And I guess any friend would do that, but I hadn't really ever had a guy do that for me. So it just, it was sweet. And so I ended up going back home. I had been out of the house for about 2 weeks and I ended up going back home and we just continued dating. I was 19. He had a motorcycle. We'd go driving off on the motorcycle and he was like putty in the palm of my hand in those years. He would have done anything for me. He just really, he loved me and I loved him. And it was at that point, I didn't know about the rough side of his life. All I saw was his parents who had been married for 25 years. And that's what I wanted. And so I saw his life as a stable childhood. I didn't know any better yet.
You saw the Norman Rockwell painting.
Yes. The parents,
you didn't see what was behind it.
Yeah. The whole family lives in the same town. They're not bouncing around like I did. My mom had 3 marriages. It's just like my ideal was I want to get married one time. That's it. And I thought, because that's what he came from, that's what I would get to. And we'll get there, but to a certain extent I did. But
did you know you can get divorced without hiring an attorney? Let ourdivorce.com guide you through our 3-step process for a simple flat fee. Visit ourdivorce.com to learn more and get started today.
Anybody who's listened to this show knows that I've been married twice. And one of the things that I've never said publicly, not because I'm embarrassed by it, it's never come up. When my first wife and I were getting engaged, we went and talked to one of our church leaders, and it was her church leader, not mine. And so he was making sure that I was a good guy, and he interviewed me, and it was almost like a job interview. And he said, "Tell me about your parents." And I said, at that time, they'd been married for 48 years or 50 years or whatever it was. Both sets of grandparents stayed married their entire lives. I had older siblings who were all married to one person. Both my grandfathers are Eagle Scouts. My dad's an Eagle Scout. All of my brothers and I are Eagle Scouts. You're going down this list, and he just goes, "So what you're saying is that if you were a publicly traded company, it would be a good investment in your family." And I never thought about it like that, because it was just normal. This was what everybody did. I didn't have I'm looking for stability, because that's all I ever knew.
Right.
But I look back now, and of course, here I am, twice divorced, and I can't blame my family over my home life or anything. It's all on me, of course. But it's an interesting thing that people, when we get to know the background of our guests, you can start to see where their motivations came from. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're dating, you're 19. At some point you got engaged, but let's keep the dating thing going. How long did you date before you got engaged?
Okay, there's a twist. There's got to be a twist.
No. Yeah.
We dated when I first met him when I was 19. Actually, I think I was 18. It was like the spring right before I turned 18, but into my 19th year. So we dated about a year and a half. And then I decided I wanted to go back to college. And he did not want to do a long distance relationship.
That's tough.
He made no bones about it. He didn't want to have a long distance relationship. He knew himself very well. He needs relationships. He needs a relationship in his life. And so now looking back, I think he probably knew he couldn't do it. And so he wasn't even going to try.
I guess there's something to be said for that kind of
So we went on our separate paths. We barely communicated the whole time I was in college. I ended up dating someone else for 3 years and actually got engaged to that person. And he ended up seriously dating someone else, getting her pregnant, and getting engaged to another person. So we both were engaged to different people. Things fell apart for him and his baby mama, and things fell apart for me and my special guy from school, all about the same time. And so we started communicating again. So it was my senior year in college, and it was like spring semester. So we weren't dating. He was, by this time we're drinking age. He's going out to clubs and meeting people and being a dog. And he wasn't about to give that up. But when I came back, and same thing. So when I graduated and came home, he said, "Listen, I would like to date you, but I can't date you exclusively." And his reasoning was that his baby's mom knew about me and was very jealous of me. And so I was the last person that he should be exclusively dating. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. And he didn't want to lose visitation. And she was a little bit, they were not getting along at all. And so there was that, using the child as a manipulation tool. And he was afraid he'd lose visitation and all of that kind of stuff. That's his story. And so I'm like, okay, but if that's the way you're going to do it, you have to understand that I'm going to do the same thing. And he said, "That's okay."
Good for you.
I was good friends with his family, with his sisters, and his older sister was married and she had 2 children, and I was hanging out at her house one day, and one of her guy friends came over and was visiting, and you could tell he just took a liking to me right away, and he ended up asked me to go on a date. I knew that it would get back to Rick. And so I'm like, oh, okay, love to. And Rick did hear about it. And so that same night, I was sleeping in my house and I heard Rick outside going, Lorrie! I'm like, stop, you're going to wake everybody up. Of course, he'd probably been out at the club and it was the middle of the night and he was probably drinking. And he's like, I want to talk to you. I'm like, I'm not coming out right now. Talk to you in the morning. Go home. And so then when I came out the next morning, I had to go to maybe I was going to work or something. But the shirt he had been wearing the night before was hanging on the antenna of my car. And he had written on it in permanent marker, Lorrie Weibel, #1. I'm like, I ended up calling him later that day and I'm like, what is this t-shirt? What is this shirt? And he's like, what do you think it is? I'm like, I don't know. You wrote Lorrie Weibel #1. I don't know what that means. And he hawed around. I'm like, does that mean you just want to date me exclusively now? Yes. Okay. So it's just like he heard that I dated and he couldn't handle it. And he really was, at that point, once he made that decision, he was done being a dog. So this second time around, I graduated in June. I think it was about September. I applied for a job with Southwest Airlines. I wanted to be a flight attendant. And they accepted my application. They flew me down to Dallas for my first interview. Went great. They called me up for my second interview. And at this point, I knew if it went through, I was going to be moving to Texas. And so I sat down with them and I'm like, look, I never, ever wanted to live in the Midwest. It was always my intention to move south after graduation. And the only reason I am here is for you. So if this isn't going anywhere, you need to tell me. And we talked about it a little while. And I'm like, do you mean I need to make a decision about marriage? And I'm like, yeah, I need to know how serious you are. He's like, let me think about it. And 2 hours later, he called me and he just said, okay, what? Okay, I'll marry you. That was my proposal.
That was such a sentimental story.
I know. Oh my God.
Hey, you guys out there, if you're not crying over that romantic gesture, you're not alive.
Yeah.
So did he buy you a ring ever?
Eventually. So I think like after that, maybe the next time we saw each other and I came over, he had by that time purchased a bouquet of flowers that he bought off the street corner and said, will you marry me? And put the flowers in front of my face. And honestly, I don't even remember for sure if he ever said those actual words. Will you marry me? I really can't remember if he ever actually said that. But we ended up getting married somehow.
Somehow. So at this point, you've known each other for what, 4 years-ish?
Yeah. By the time we got married, we knew each other 5. So we have known each other about 4 years.
So you get engaged through this incredibly sentimental, romantic thing that you always want to tell your grandkids about. And he buys you some flowers and at some point a ring. What was he doing for a living at that point?
Heating and air. He was working as like a service guy for heating and air conditioning company.
So a solid job / career. He's not an investment banker, but he's got a solid plan for the future. So he never got married before you guys, but he did have a child. And so let's fast forward now. So you're engaged for roughly a year. Sounds like.
It was like October to March. We got married in the following March, so it wasn't even a year.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wait. That sounds really fast. But oh my God, that was fast.
So you got engaged in October and married in March, so just 4 or 5 months.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And was it a big wedding?
Okay.
Was it
Yes.
Hundreds of people?
We had about 200 people. My mom was also working in the finance center, and she was a bigwig by that time, and she really wanted to impress everybody that she worked with. So she was completely willing to have a huge wedding and finance the whole thing. It was very important to her. I just wanted to have a pitch in and just
Hmm.
enjoy, but she wanted to do it big, which in the end, I'm glad. It was very nice, very memorable. We did the church wedding. I had a big wedding gown. We had all our very kind of traditional church wedding, long receiving line. We had a reception. I think it was like the local Marriott, which was one of the nicer ballrooms at the time, and complete with the bridal table and assigned seating and served the dinner served. I always heard that the more money you spend on the wedding, the longer your marriage will last. I don't know if that's true or not.
That explains my first marriage. Actually, that doesn't explain either of them because my second marriage, we actually just went to the courthouse and we went for 18 years. And so,
Wow.
well, okay. So you're married, everybody's happy. You've worked out the religious difference. I don't want to necessarily prevent any future talk of Rick's child from prior, but did you become stepmom? Did that
Oh,
ever turn
yes.
into any sort of, so you have a relationship with Rick's
Yes.
daughter?
Yes. In fact, during the wedding ceremony, I also wrote vows to her. So
Oh,
she was
cool.
only she was a year old when I was introduced to her life. And even though we had hoped that she would be able to be at the wedding, but like I said, they were not getting along. It wasn't his visitation weekend, so she wouldn't let Brooke come to the wedding.
Are
So,
you kidding? Gal, that's petty.
yeah, he had his regular visitation. The financially, the first year was really rough financially because he was paying back child support, and it was
Mm.
like 60% of his paycheck or something like that. It was mashed potatoes and tuna fish and government cheese.
Yeah, but you probably look back on that as some of the best times of your life. But did baby mama ever lighten up?
My stepdaughter has, as she got older, she told me that she thinks that the reason her mom was so bitter was that I got a good version of Rick and she did not. She got the version where, and he partied all the time. He was experimenting with
Mm.
drugs. Family was not in the plan. It just happened that way. And when it came down to it, she made the choice that she was done with him because of his poor behavior. And then when I came along, he straightened up. And so my stepdaughter
Mm.
says that she thinks that's the reason. There's the rejection factor, like why couldn't he have done that for me? And I feel that way now about it. Didn't make it any easier that she knew I had been in his life before. And
Mhm.
so she I'm just interpreting from the past. She may have felt like she was just holding him over until I came back from school. That
She was
she
the
would
foster
never,
mom.
yeah, she would have never filled that spot because he had always been pining away from me.
So
Yeah.
you just said that the first year was pretty tough financially, but you guys, you're in love other than the the stepdaughter, which he had part time and all that. But you had this wonderful, your young love. Everybody's happy. Did it just start out blissfully great, other than the money?
So there was arguing, but I didn't. My grandparents didn't argue that way, but my mom and my dad's may have when I was younger. So
Hmm.
I had a good example of what a married couple should be from my grandparent, but I don't know. I don't think I knew what a healthy relationship was, and to me that felt normal.
To be
Um,
able to have some pretty knockdown, drag out fights was a
yeah,
normal thing.
yeah. And the worst was when we got into argument and we're like face to face, and I slapped him, and he slapped me right back,
Wow.
and I was like, oh, I couldn't believe he slapped me right back. And he goes, I will never hit you as long as you don't hit me. And I was like, okay. And so he never
I'll receive a
did.
lot of hate for this, but good for him.
Well, yeah, it wasn't his pattern of behavior. And he lived up to it. He never ever hit me again. And I never hit him again. I don't think, even though there was the fighting, we didn't need to let it go down that path. And We didn't have, and the interesting thing is, both of us had that in our history. He was a violent drunk too when he would drink. And if he was drinking bourbon, it never ended. There'd be holes in the wall.
If he got drunk, especially on bourbon, he'd put holes in the wall and overturn furniture because he was fighting with you, but he wouldn't hit you. Or why was he turning over furniture?
Yeah, no, actually, if in those circumstances, it was very rarely me. It was always somebody else that upset him. Or if he'd go to the club, he got mad one time because someone he met from kindergarten didn't remember who he was.
Oh, how dare him or her?
I know. So like he was mad and he was in the bathroom and he was trying to hit the hand dryer that was on the wall and missed and hit the brick wall instead and broke his hand. He had a little bit of anger in there.
Yeah.
But I go into that, but at the same time, I still look at that part of our lives and that stuff was icky, but he was a good person. He loved me. Once we had kids, he was a fantastic father to the kids. We always had a roof over our head. All the basics were taken care of. And he was kind. He did things for other people. It's just, we may not have been the perfect match, but we did make it work somehow.
And then you guys had kids. How many kids do you have?
We had 2 together, and then we had my stepdaughter. So we had, my oldest is a boy, and then I have a younger daughter who's about 2 years behind him. So 3 total, including my stepdaughter. There was a very good part of the marriage. There's a part of the marriage that I look back at, and I'm like, that was my favorite. We were living in a rural town. The kids were going to a smaller high school. They were all involved in extracurricular activities. We, as a family, were all supporting the kids. And we actually started getting really involved in the church. It was just like a non-denominational Christian church. Okay. And the interesting thing was we had gone through a bad time in the marriage, and he felt like the best place to get rules was the church because the Bible has rules. So we're going to go to church. So we searched for a church. We found a wonderful church. At that time, it was new where people were starting to wear jeans, and like on Friday night, they would have Christian musicians come in and they'd have a little Christian concert, and we'd come to church the next day. That was a really good time in our life. And then when the kids started getting to be teenagers, we were having a small rural town. There is nothing to do but drink and do drugs. And so we were starting to have those conversations with the kids. And I'm like, I have no experience with this, Rick. You need to start having these conversations because you know what that's about. But he didn't have an addictive personality where some of the other people in his family did. And so he never felt the consequences of what drugs could do. And so all he could think of was the good times with the drugs and the alcohol. So that was not helpful with the kids. Anyway, I'm not saying that it's his fault at all, but it was just a struggle trying to figure out how do we guide the kids during this. Fortunately, it was a small town and all the parents knew each other and were calling and tattling on each other's kids. But we had found out that my son was smoking pot and he was 15, I think. He was really going down the wrong path. We just couldn't figure out what to do with him. No matter what we did, he just kept doing whatever he wanted. And finally, we got to the point where we wrote up a contract with him because that was what was suggested by the youth pastor, like a 3-strike contract. So first strike, we take away your car or whatever. Second strike, I don't remember what it was, but the third strike was that he was going to go to boarding school. And
like military boarding school thing?
He was going to have a choice. And actually, by the time he got to the third strike, he and I were touring different boarding schools so that he could select because he was not getting the contract together. So
spoiler alert, everyone. He got to the third strike.
Yeah, he got to the third strike. we found a school in Tennessee that was willing to give him scholarship money to go for wrestling. And we figured out in our budget we could afford to send him to that school. And then when the time came, Rick didn't want to send him. I don't want to miss all his wrestling. So I'm like, oh my God, this totally defeats the purpose. So the next strike we'll deal with this. I'm like, oh my God. So anyway, there was a next strike. And we had visited a military school. And so that was the thing. We'd said, okay, we've given you all your chances. So if you screw up again, you don't have a choice. You're going to this military school in North Indiana. And he screwed up again and ran away. Oh my God. I was freaking out. We called all his friends. Nobody knew where he was. I was imagining him on the highway, hitchhiking and getting picked up by a trucker. We did end up finding him, but we can't deal with this. So we didn't tell him. We told him, we're going to send you to my sister's house. She was living in Texas at the time. And you just need to take a break and think about what's going on. And then we just left him there. So he ended up staying with my sister. And he was mad at us because we didn't tell him what was going on. But we're like, you've completely lied to us and every chance. And if we had told you that you were going to stay down there, you wouldn't have gone. And we're the grown-ups, by golly.
Mm-hmm.
So
Exactly.
yeah. So we needed to get him away. We felt like we needed to get him away from his friends and that he could get a fresh start. I guess it turned out that he was the problem, not the friends. So he kind of he wasn't nearly as rebellious living with my sister. He was still like smoking pot, and I don't think he was partying or anything, but if he was hanging out with a friend, they'd probably smoke. But he spent his junior year down there. And so after his junior year, we're like, okay, you can come home. And he said, I don't want to. I want to stay in Texas. I like this school. And so we're like, this is the last year you're going to be a kid. Rick and I talked, and we had always thought that after the kids were grown, we were going to go to Texas anyway. And the kids were getting to the point where they would start looking at colleges. And we decided that we'll go ahead and go now. You cool with that? Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
So you guys moved to Texas to catch up to your son. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
We moved down here, and that's when things changed. I won't say they went downhill right away, but Rick was not as happy here in Texas as he was in Indiana. I was used to uprooting all the time.
Mm-hmm.
He had lived in Indiana his entire life, and he thought that it would be okay. So, I don't need to be here with my family. It's not a big deal. It's not like my life is focused around them. I don't think that we really thought about everything that we'd be giving up. Our church, our friends, we really were starting over. And he was not happy at first. Heating and cooling, air conditioning in a house in San Antonio, there's no crawl spaces because it's all rock. So you have to get up in an attic, which is like 140 degrees. And so the heating and air industry, he's still doing it, but he was miserable. There was a point in our marriage where, and this was a sticking point, not our entire marriage, but yeah, our entire marriage. I'm a quality time person. You talk about love languages, and I don't know if it's my top, but it's up there. It's in the top 2 is quality time. And his is acts of service. And so he'd be off doing acts of service for everybody else. And he's not with me, which is my love language. And so I would want to, I'm like, can we just schedule a date once a week? Can we just commit to spending some time together? And he's like, he never would, because he thought it was stupid to calendar in a date with your wife. And so there was that thing where, as all marriages go through this slump where there's no romance, and you miss having the companionship of that other person. And so at one point we had talked about this, and he's just, I can't be your everything. You need to figure out how to be happy without me. Literally, those were his words. You need to learn how to be happy without me in a marriage. And so I'm like, okay. So I started to do things on my own. That's when I started running. And because I actually was working for the school district at the time, some things happened where I ended up being the wrestling coach for the high school team. And so I
Wow.
think he was a little, I know, he was a little jealous, I think, that I got to be a wrestling coach and he didn't. And I found my groove. I had a lot of friends in the school district, and we just weren't living different lives. He had his friends in his heating and air group, and they were totally different types of friends. My friends were educated, and their pastimes were completely different. And he and his buddies, we're going to all go watch the MMA fight at house. I'm like, oh, I really don't want to come. And I liked watching mixed martial arts, but the group of people that he was hanging out with, like, they just made I won't say they made my skin crawl, but it just was very uncomfortable for me to be around people who were vulgar and crass and racist. And
Mm.
I just didn't want to spend time with them. Since we had been very active in the church, I really tried to be the submissive wife. And if I couldn't, there was one time where I think I was trying to have a productive discourse with him. And he said, "Why can't you just be obedient?" just,
Oh
but
my. I can't even imagine you being a submissive person, by the way.
yes, I know. I am telling you, I tried really hard and to enforce it. I would read all the verses in the Bible about you should submit to your husband in as much as he's to Christ, or whatever that verse is.
Yep.
And in my head, I'm like, but he's not submitting to the church. He's not submitting to Christ. So I'm like,
Right.
it goes both ways. So there would be things that would happen. Like he wanted to move to this house. This is really where everything fell apart. We were still renting, and every 2 years he'd find a better deal and a bigger house that he liked. One of the guys that he was doing some work for owned a lot of property, was a real estate investor, and rented out his properties. And Rick found one of the properties that had a small little farmhouse, and it was on 10 acres and wooded, which is hard to find in that area of Texas. Really beautiful property, but the house it needed so much work. And it was a time in our lives where it was only 2 bedrooms, and we had 2 kids still in and out of the house. Granted, they were in college, but they were still coming back and forth. And his mom was getting ready to come live with us. And I'm like, I
Oh wow.
understand that you want this, but this is not the right time. And so we talked about it, but in the end, because the kind of rule was we'd talk about it, but if there was a disagreement, he got to make the choice because he's the husband,
Mm.
he's the man. And so I'm just like, okay, I don't agree, but what am I going to do? And so we moved into this flipping house, and it's a construction zone the whole time. I was going through menopause, so I wasn't on my best behavior, and I probably was a little bitchy, but much of the time. And I do recall making like little passive aggressive jabs once in a while about the house, or because I did not want to be there. And
Hmm.
he's like, I feel like you hate me. And I'm like, I don't hate you. Just, I don't hate you. I'm not happy in this situation. So it was during that time that his mother was getting ready to turn 70 back in Indiana. Oh, okay. So she had just stayed with us for 6 months. She wanted to do the winter Texan thing, and then she went back to Indiana. And she was turning 70, and so he wanted to go up and celebrate her 70th birthday with the rest of his family. And his sister had arranged a big party at, I think it was a club called Cowboys or something like that. And I'm like, okay, great. I'm going to stay back. I've got wrestling matches or whatever I was doing at the time. And
Right.
so he went, and I normally didn't do this, I swear. But for some reason that night, I located him on his phone, and I could see that his phone, I don't know, didn't know how accurate it was, but it was at the club somewhere. It looked like it was more in the parking lot. But at like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, I'm still checking. It's still there. And all night, it was still there.
And this
I'm
was
like,
the club
what
where the
the
party
heck?
was supposed to be?
Yeah, yeah. And so the next day, when he called, I asked him about it, and he said something. Or actually, I don't even know if I asked him about it. Whatever we talked about at that time, I could tell in his voice something was off. And there was just like this gut feeling that something was wrong, and it was weird that his phone was there all night. It was out of character. And I'm just like, I'm breaking into his Facebook. I knew his password and I knew his email. He never used the computer at all. I had to set it up all for him. So it wasn't like I just knew what everything was, and I went in. And when I went into his Facebook, there was a conversation between him and this other woman. And from the conversation, it was evident that he had spent the night at her house. And then this was like the next day, and they were planning to meet out for lunch or something. There wasn't a whole lot there, but I could tell the gist of what happened.
Divorce doesn't have to be complicated. Our Divorce.com's 3-step procedure provides a simple and affordable process that you can follow at your own pace. Save thousands by visiting ourdivorce.com today.
So let me see if I get the timeline right. So you were invited to the party. You chose not to go, or for whatever reason, you decided not to go up to Indiana. And probably about that point is when he started making the plans with this lady. How did they meet up then?
Okay, so since it was a birthday party for his mom, a lot of people were invited. Family, friends from childhood. So the woman that he met up with was a childhood friend that
Of his.
he had grown up with. And so they were catching up. And turns out she was going through, his story was, she's going through a divorce and she just really needed to talk to somebody. And so nothing happened. I just went to her house. I slept on the couch, said she's going through a divorce, so she didn't want to do anything. And I heard from his family that they had tried to get him to come home with them because he was really drunk, and he wouldn't go. And she said, I'll take care of him. Don't worry about it. He's in safe hands. And so he went with her. And he had left his phone purposely in his car, whatever car he was driving at the time, in the parking lot so that I couldn't trace him at this lady's house.
That's not guilty behavior at all.
Yeah. So when he got home and we were talking about it, like he said, and I believed him that nothing happened. But the thing that made me upset was him saying nothing happened because she didn't want it to. That she's going through a divorce. She didn't want to make a mistake, so she didn't want to do anything. And so I was like, oh, so if she had wanted to, you would have. And he didn't answer.
Wow.
And so
Okay.
we tried for a couple days to just work through it. And I was just like, I don't know what to do. I don't want a divorce, but we need some space. And so he moved out. The guy who was a real estate investor had a little cabin on the lake nearby. It literally was like half a mile away from where we were living. And so he just moved his stuff out there and he was living there. And we were still like communicating and spending time with each other and trying to figure out what we did or wanted to do. And I said, I'm willing to work on it if you promise me that you won't go back to Indiana for your class reunion. because my concern was that woman was still there and that he would use that as an opportunity to go further in that relationship. And he agreed he wouldn't go to the class reunion. The day before he was scheduled, that he was originally scheduled to fly out, he called me and said that he changed his mind. He wanted to go to the reunion. And so I flipped my lid. I couldn't believe it was like he just reneged on the whole deal, and I didn't understand. Of course, I'm like, you know what that means? I said we wouldn't work on it anymore, then we're going to have to get a divorce. And he's like, okay.
That's how you got engaged? By saying okay? And that's how you decided to get a divorce, as he said okay.
Oh my God.
We could just end the podcast.
Yes. So after the reunion was over, he stayed. He was going to stay a little longer through a long weekend, because all his friends always go to this campground. They all have their like little RVs there, and they like rent their spaces for the summer. And so they were all going to go hang out at the campground for the weekend. And after the campground weekend was over and he came home, the first thing that he said was, I want a divorce. We're done. And during that time, I could even tell something was going on. And I had the feeling that he had met someone or something. And what really sent it over the edge as far as my suspicions were concerned was for his birthday, he said, I'm going to go to Indiana for my birthday because obviously it's just going to be awkward here. So as he starts driving, then I break into his Facebook, and then I see a very long string of conversations between him and a completely different woman. And they were very upsetting. Some sexual in nature, just hearing him talk that way or seeing him talk that way to somebody else just tore me apart.
Yeah.
But also made me very mad.
Yeah, I understand completely.
Because I was in his Facebook and I could see what this woman's name was, and I could see that they now were friends on Facebook. I posted a message, or I posted on her wall as if I were him, something along the lines, I'm so glad I met you. You're the woman for me. I love cheating on my wife with you because you're such a great fish. You love fishing. And I'm like, and I posted it. And then I started getting phone calls and I'm like, oh shit. And so I unposted it, but it was too late. Everybody had seen it.
Cat's out of the bag.
Until you've been through something like that, I don't think you understand like the full devastation of divorce when you've been cheated on. I think it might be different if it's over finances or you just can't stop arguing or whatever, but when it's someone else has come into the picture, it's devastating.
I will
Sorry.
say, I talk about this a lot on TikTok about how the things that my ex-wife, we call her Trinity, when she cheated the first time, according to her, it was purely physical. There was no emotions. Now, I've learned later that was garbage, but it was a sexual affair primarily. Her second affair wasn't a sexual affair at all because he lived 1,800 miles away in Philadelphia. It was a purely emotional affair. And I will say that the emotional affair hurt 1,000 times worse. Mm-hmm. And it's because of the fact that I was no longer her best friend. She didn't care about talking to me about anything. She had become so detached from me as a friend.
Oh my God.
It's not even about, yes, of course, it's about spouse and marriage and love and all that. But I wasn't even her friend anymore. It used to be that something would happen at work and she'd want to call me and say, you're not going to believe how cool this was. That stopped. She called him. Yeah. And he was the first guy she wanted to talk to in the morning, the last guy she wanted to talk to at night. And I was naive enough to not even understand that an emotional affair is an affair. I just thought, oh my gosh, they're really good friends. how do I win her back as a friend? That's all I was
Right.
trying to do. And by then it was way too late. So,
Yeah.
like you said, unless and until you get cheated on, you will never understand. By the
Yeah.
way, at some point in here, you get divorced. Have we started divorce proceedings yet?
I started the paperwork. We couldn't afford an attorney. We decided we were going to do it like representing ourselves. And since I had some legal background, I felt pretty confident about what I was doing. But so I figured I didn't have any actual documents, and I found LegalZoom or something, which was crap at the time. It probably still is, but it's the only thing that was available to me at the time if I was doing pro se divorces. At that time, I don't think there was very much help for people representing themselves. But we were starting the paperwork on that. Yeah, yeah, we'll keep the divorce in progress. So we weren't divorced yet. He started dating right away. The divorce went through on February 9th, 2016. It was close to Valentine's Day, so I'll never forget.
My divorce decree is Valentine's Day, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah, the judge signed it on Valentine's Day.
Oh my
I think it's
God.
great.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
by
it
the
kind of
way,
is.
if I were a judge, I would literally save up every divorce from the end of January and for the first 2 weeks of February, and I would sign all of them on the 14th just because I think it's so perfect. Okay, so you're divorced nearly Valentine's Day, 2016.
Got
He's
back to
still
the
up in Indianapolis.
Yes. Yeah. He's completely left. He's put his roots down again. He's starting a business. He has decided that's where he's moving forward. He and I had talked about at one point was like, what you did was so drastic. Like you didn't just pick up and leave and decide to have a divorce. You picked up and left over 1,000 miles away and made it so it's almost impossible for us to get back together. And he said, that he thinks subconsciously he did that on purpose is he knew that if he stayed in Texas, he'd get back together with me. And he didn't want to, which I guess I understand. Like
Yeah.
that if you try to we've made hard things work before. He knew that we could probably make it work again, that we'd get through it, but he didn't want to. He didn't, for whatever reason, he didn't want that life anymore.
And I go back to what I said earlier that I think that some of his decisions have been completely shitty. I think the fact that he knows himself well enough, he knew he didn't want to be married to you anymore for
Right.
whatever reason, right or wrong. He didn't want to be married to you anymore, but he knows that if he sticks around, he's going to get back with you. I get the feeling this is not the end of the story.
I was trying to do the thing that you don't date for a year. I was teaching, so I was very busy. And I started doing things. I was trying to be proactive about moving forward and having a new life. And then he called me one day and he said, I have to talk to you. I'm like, oh shit. I need your advice. Okay. So I went camping last weekend and I met somebody at the campground. At the same campground.
The same campground.
The same campground that he met the woman that he cheated on me with. Yeah, he met the first one at the campground, dated somebody else, and then he met the second one at the campground and cheated on his current girlfriend with this woman. What he needed my advice about was how to handle the situation that he caused because of the way he broke up with his girlfriend. He just texted her. He text messaged her. I'm sorry to do it this way, but I don't want to be with you anymore. I want to break up. And that's it. And so as she started texting him back, he didn't answer because he didn't know how to handle it. He's not very good at breakups.
And so he calls you and says, Lorrie, here's how bad I've screwed everything up. I need your advice on how to talk my way out of it.
Yes. I'm like, you have got to talk to her. He said, she's going to beg me back. And I know. And it was the same thing. Like he didn't want to give in to that relationship because now he's got this new girl who, by the way, must have been super hot and sexy because she was a stripper.
Currently? Like when he met her? Or like a retired stripper?
She was a retired stripper. I've seen pictures of her. She was very busty, it looks like she'd had work done on her face and other places. But yeah, she had been a stripper her whole life, her whole working life until she couldn't strip anymore. He's telling me all of this. And he's like, I've made this mistake. I know I did this the wrong way. I don't know how to recover. I'm like, you've got to talk to her. But so anyway, that was the end of the next serious relationship that he had. I had started dating again by that point. So it was just still the same kind of thing. I would never initiate calls to him, but he would always call me and then we'd chit chat about what was going on. But yeah, it's a campground of love.
Yeah, that is the campground of love. Yeah, it's like the Love Boat with tent. Okay, hold on for a minute. So is he with the stripper today?
Currently? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. They got married.
How long have they been together then?
They've been married over 2 years. In December, it will be 3 years. She got a big honkin' ring, and he asked her to marry him the right way.
Oh, really? He didn't just say, okay, fine.
No, I'm acting bitter, but I'm not. Really.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
We're now older, wiser. We've grown, we've learned.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you want to share with our listeners? What's that one piece of advice that maybe you wish you had heard, or what do you want to say?
Or did hear and didn't listen, but now have learned.
Right.
Because really, that's what it is for me. My advice would be to spend some extended time single. And I can't even, the advice usually is to spend a year, don't date, get yourself together. But the thing is, you learn, unfortunately, through whatever relationship you have right after your marriage ends, you're so vulnerable and you're so messed up and raw that you're like wanting love from anywhere. You need to make that commitment to yourself because you deserve it. You deserve the opportunity to learn how freaking wonderful you are. And that's all. It doesn't have to be right after divorce because you might need an abusive relationship after that to learn something. But at some point, you need to commit some time to learn about yourself. That's all.
I absolutely love it. It's beautiful advice. In fact, I have said that I didn't have an abusive relationship after my divorce. I had a stupid relationship after my divorce.
Yeah.
I thought it was the perfect relationship until it wasn't anymore. It finally dawned on me just a few months ago. This has not been that long. So I've been divorced. At that point, it was right around the 2-year mark from the divorce when I realized that I wasn't looking for a partner. I had been looking for a security blanket. And so it's what you just described is exactly what I think Rick has not figured out. All right, Lorrie, I appreciate all you do for our company. I appreciate the friendship that we've built over these last couple of years. I love working with you. And thank you for taking the time to tell your story today. I know this wasn't easy for you.
Yeah.
And I really do appreciate it. And your kids are lucky. I know that you've got your mom living with you, and she's lucky to have someone so loving to take care of her right now.
Yeah.
So thank you for being
Most of the time. Not always up here.
That's right.
All the actions are loving, but not everything up here.
Yeah, that's right. Sometimes you got to fake it. Such simple yet profound advice. We all need to love ourselves before we can truly love another. It's beautiful. Well, guys, that's a person that's overcome a lot. I really appreciate Lorrie's willingness to be on the show and to share such a personal story. And I'm not overstating anything when I tell you how important Lorrie is to the current and future success of ourdivorce.com. So I will be forever in her debt. That's the show for this week. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating on your podcast app and have an amazing week. Bye.
It's a great day, I'm feeling good. Oh, the possibilities of what I could, do with the world at my fingertips. My imagination brings a smile up to my lips.
Divorce doesn't have to be complicated. Our Divorce.com's 3-step procedure provides a simple and affordable process that you can follow at your own pace. Save thousands by visiting ourdivorce.com today.